Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. There's been a lot of discussion over the Switch 2 since we learned more about it at the start of April. And by discussion, I mean a lot of people greatly upset over the cost of it. When I saw the sheer amount of backlash, it honestly did catch me by surprise. Though looking over the reasons, I suppose I shouldn't be. Long story short, while I think the price of the Switch 2 itself is fine, given that it's comparable to what you'd see for the Steam Deck, there's a lot of little ways that Nintendo seems to be nickel and diming the consumer. Whether it be locking game chat behind the online mode, asking us to buy a webcam accessory to take full advantage of it, thinking it's a good idea to ask for a small fee for both the Welcome Tour and the open world Zelda game performance boost, and then $80 Mario Kart? What the hell is even that? One of those would be annoying, but all of them at once seem to have set off a firestorm the likes of which I haven't seen since EA Battlefront 2's loot box scandal. That said, while it might dissuade me from directly paying for any of that, it won't dissuade me from getting the console. The idea of getting to play Metroid Prime 4 with mouse support has me salivating as a PC gamer, and I was already anticipating a higher price for the console, and have been saving up accordingly, so I'm okay with what's being offered there. Having laid out my bias, we now come to an individual calling himself Golden Owl, who has taken up the unenviable task to try and explain why exactly the $80 Mario Kart price tag should have been expected. According to his channel description, he's a former game dev from Singapore who's training to be a business guy, so in theory he's the right person for the job. Without further ado, let's find out if that's true.
How much should a video game cost? According to Nintendo, for their new Switch 2, that answer is $79.99. When I first heard that, my immediate reaction was essentially, yeah, that's logical.
And I look forward to hearing why you believe that.
This opinion is not shared by most gamers, however, if online sentiment is any indication. Lots of accusations of Nintendo being greedy, the games and console being overpriced, and general negativity. At least, more than usual.
As I've hopefully made clear, it's not just Mario Kart at 80 that's the problem. It's a combination of everything else leading to death by 1,000 cuts. Though I will grant you that there was some confusion due to the European website listing different prices for physical and digital, which led to wild speculation that the physical edition stateside would be $90, which doesn't appear to be the case. If that was the case, they would have said as much when they raised accessory prices recently.
However, even after some time, my initial opinion remains unchanged. Based on my current knowledge of both the state of the game industry and Nintendo's business operations, a 90 to over 100 USD price tag on Switch 2 games in stores is a fairly logical possibility in the future.
And it's an expectation that'll be met with quite a lot of backlash if it happens, so time will tell as to when and how.
After all, there is a very high chance that launch prices will be increased due to the recent tariff increase by the US on many countries, including Japan.
I won't dismiss that tariffs might play a role, though it's not Japan you need to be concerned about, but Vietnam, as the first Switch had some of its production handled there to avoid trade war shenanigans in 2017. It's still up in the air as to what kind of deal is being reached between the US and Vietnam regarding the current back and forth, so it's too early to tell. All we've seen at the time of recording is a small increase to accessory prices, though the Switch 2's price has remained as is, which could change if a deal isn't reached and the tariffs go from 10% to 46%.
In other words, yes, I am indeed saying that all those people are wrong, and this video is here to explain why.
Alright, you think all of us are wrong for saying the price is too damn high? Bold words. Let's see what you've got to back them up.
Jokes aside, here are some important disclaimers. This video isn't intended to defend Nintendo's stance or accuse people of being cheapskates. However, this is also not to lambast Nintendo or support any calls for a price change. In fact, I have literally zero emotions or feelings about pricing matters whatsoever. I maintain an attitude of total and absolute neutrality, because I am simply emotionally dead inside whenever I have to do anything that involves economics or business analysis. I've stared at so many financial industry and company reports throughout my MBA that not even Nintendo can elicit a modicum of excitement from me for financial analysis. My heart lies in games and design, not finance. My brain can handle that. Or maybe my liver. Goodness knows I could use a drink sometimes.
Aye, fair enough.
We'll see if you hold to that over the course of this video, though giving that much of a disclaimer makes me wonder about that. Well, I also know how this goes since this is a scripted response, but you'll see before too long. Either way, a simple, hey, I'm not gonna say anyone's a cheapskate or call Nintendo greedy is all you need to say, as otherwise one might go, methinks the owl doth protest too much. I mean, you're working on an NBA according to your YouTube bio, and you're telling me your eyes glaze over this much when dealing with finances? Ah well, let's get to the video proper.
This video is also not here to justify the prices.
Then what is the point of this video? There is a separate conversation as to whether we're willing to pay the asking price, but isn't explaining why a price was set that way a justification of sorts? I know this is semantics, but the words we use are important, so I'm gonna be that guy.
All of us share the same love for games, but come from different countries and socio-economic backgrounds. Everyone's financial circumstances are different. A price change could impact some people comparatively more than others. Just being in a different country with a different economy can drastically impact your spending power. We cannot simply state, just admit that you're broke, or Nintendo is too greedy and call it a day.
Perhaps not, but when you're the guy living paycheck to paycheck and can only afford one console or one game once in a blue moon, one can hardly blame you for being upset when you learn the time frame between new games just went up. You as a guy trying to get into business and me as a guy in software have the luxury to research and debate the finer points, since we're not having to spend time fretting over whether we can afford groceries this month. Though you are working to an MBA, so correct me if I'm wrong and you're closer to broke college student status than six-figure businessman.
Anybody unironically saying these things needs to seriously widen their global perspective.
Y'all are stupid!
Nintendo is a Japanese company operating an international business on a global scale. They don't make decisions based on such simplistic blanket opinions. In fact, knowing the Japanese, they probably have meetings to schedule additional meetings.
Implying that's a Japan-only phenomenon? Who's the one who needs to widen their perspective here? In all seriousness, and at the risk of sounding dismissive, the consumer's priority is to determine for themselves whether they can afford it or are willing to pay for it. And it doesn't matter whether it's their video games or their electric bill. If it goes up in price, there's gonna be complaints.
Simple answers like supply and demand also aren't going to cut it. You don't get paid just for basic high school economics. Whether you feel that Switch 2 games are worth the price is not what this video is about. This video is about the economics and game development related factors which led to this price point. It is an explanation, nothing more, nothing less.
Alright, so it looks like I ended up in the weeds there given the stated focus of your video, as we seem to be on the same page as far as the distinction between reason for happening as opposed to I like or dislike this is happening. As far as introductions go, it was decent, since it gave me a good sense of your stance and focus, but if you're going to spend part of it going, oi, you guys are wrong and uneducated, you're going to make it harder to appeal to the very people this video is presumably targeted at. I'll grant you that this is the internet, and therefore playful and not so playful banter is to be expected, but if you're looking to take the detached this is how it is approach, commit to it full stop, or you're going to make your task harder than it needs to be.
First, let us answer this question. What is the real price of a video game? Notice the capitalization.
Whatever people are willing to pay for it. Okay, I know that's a cheeky overgeneralization, but that is what economics boils down to. The price of something is effectively a collective agreement that the majority of people who want the thing are willing to pay for the thing, balanced against factors like the cost required to produce the thing, and whether the thing is an essential good like water or medical care. Since that video games are luxury goods, we thankfully don't have to factor the latter in here, so let's see how you define it.
Before anything, we have a key term to define. If you look at Nintendo's website, you'll notice 4 letters innocuously placed after their $79.99 price tag, MSRP. This stands for Manufacturer Suggested Retail Price, and it means exactly what it sounds like. It is a recommended price from the manufacturer to the retailer on how much to sell a product for.
Alright, good to see I won't have to yell to find your damn terms this time, much appreciated. So why bring this definition up?
This number is based on various factors like supply-demand forecasts, competitor pricing, market positioning, production costs, retailer profit margins, and so on.
Alright, continuing to make sure we're all on the same page for what this definition includes, good information. So why bring this definition up?
It does not, however, include tax. Taxes are added after. By the way, tariffs are a tax placed on imported goods, paid by the importing purchaser and usually passed down to the customer. They are not paid by the exporting manufacturer. I learned that in high school.
Okay, I know it's topical to bring up tariffs, since that could easily have an effect on the price, but this doesn't seem to be the right place to bring this up. All that needs to be said is that it doesn't factor into MSRP for the sake of your example, and to properly explain why you think a price tag of 90 or 100 is feasible in the near future. Besides, can you blame Americans for not understanding what tariffs are when, in our lifetime, the American government hasn't been levying major tariffs against its trading partners like this?
I had no idea so many people didn't know how that worked. If you are an American watching this video, I am so sorry for you.
Okay, see that? What you just did there? Remember my comment earlier about not demeaning the people you're trying to convince, because it then makes it harder to convince them? Exhibit A, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you treating this video as second monitor content who missed that, yes, he only said out loud that he feels sorry for Americans, but threw a bunch of images on screen suggesting that a lot of us don't know what tariffs are, with the implication that Americans voted for something that they don't understand. To that point, are there a lot of dumb Americans? Yes. One of those dumb Americans even let a guy like you in who seemingly dislikes the people he lives alongside. All joking aside, there are undoubtedly Americans who voted for the current administration for economic reasons that didn't understand the effect tariffs would have. And I'm not going to demand that you leave just because you made fun of my fellow countrymen, especially if some of them deserve it. That said, I would ask that you don't make blanket statements about people. To use your own logic, everyone had their own reasons for voting for one candidate or another. Economics were certainly a major talking point in the last election, but it wasn't the only major talking point. So there's plenty of people out there who think, I don't know about the tariff stuff, but I like what he's saying about this other thing. Approaching a topic like this without any nuance isn't going to be received well if you're also going to demean people for not approaching Nintendo's pricing strategy with nuance. Alright, enough of that real-world bullshit. Back to a different kind of real-world bullshit.
Anyways, MSRP is important for retailers and distributors because they have a lot of inventory to manage. Different products from numerous sources are constantly being ordered, sold, discarded, refunded, restocked, rotated out, etc. Large-scale generalist retailers like Best Buy, Walmart, Takashimaya, Lotte Group, and so on don't have the time or expertise to evaluate and micromanage individual prices, so they rely heavily on the provided MSRP to help decide on their store pricing.
Good, we're back to the main topic. I still find myself asking, though, why bring this definition up?
To a lesser extent, we as consumers can use MSRP to gauge how much a product is worth, though most of us don't really check prices for general essentials like milk and eggs. Except for that one time, I guess.
To think I diverged from a video titled "Keep Your Politics to Yourself" to make this response, only to get another reason for why I probably shouldn't have strayed off course. Fair dig, but if I want your opinion on the current administration, I'll ask you for it. There's enough real-world bullshit tied up in this discussion without dragging more in on a tangential topic.
We are more likely to check for big, one-off expensive purchases, like, I don't know, air fryers or something. Oh hey, that's a cute reference.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
Alright, decent edit, even if we've already gone off tangent pretty recently. And literally the next thing is text asking why you did that? I mean, the only reason I'd hesitate is that having two off-topic gags right next to each other is a bit jarring, especially since the first one, my concerns about the content aside, was admittedly much snappier compared to this edit. Still, a minor concern, all things considered, so let's move on.
However, note that the S in MSRP stands for suggestion. It is not a mandate.
And as you've just said, due to all the complexities of managing inventory, it's effectively treated as a benchmark for store owners and consumers alike, so why bring this definition up?
The manufacturer has no control over the retailer or distributor. They are totally free to ignore MSRP and set their own prices if they want to.
Perhaps so, but something you only touched upon briefly among many other factors is the profit margin for stores like Walmart and GameStop. The numbers vary depending on where you look, but the general consensus seems to be that for a single video game purchase at $60, the retailer only makes somewhere between $10 and $25 for that one game sale. The reason for this is simply because the rest of what you as the consumer pay is what the retailer had to pay to stock it. So even if they wanted to try and sell it for say $50, that might not even be worth their employees' time to haul it off the truck, let alone put it on a shelf. So unless they're trying to do something like empty inventory or get someone in the store for another reason, they have little reason to not charge at least MSRP in the case of a video game. So again, why bring this definition up when it's a reliable benchmark?
Some retailers and distributors take advantage of high demand to charge high prices. For example, Bergsala, a Swedish distributor in the Nordic territories, is currently pricing their Switch 2s at €100 above MSRP. I also recall Microsoft pulled a similar stunt in Singapore back during the original Switch release years ago. Though take that with a grain of salt, I don't trust my own memory.
You know, mentioning a case where a retailer is charging higher than MSRP isn't reassuring to the people you're trying to educate. It's a good example to bring up, I'll grant you, but you're better off giving an example where prices would be below MSRP.
Others will instead offer conditional discounts to encourage customers to purchase products online, register for services like Amazon Prime, as prizes for lucky draws or promotional events, and so on. Basically, if you walk into a store and buy the product directly, you pay at or above MSRP, giving the store their maximum revenue. If you participate in their promotional offer to get the discount, then you've successfully been pushed into registering for or using their service. Either way, it's a win-win for them.
Okay, good, you came around to that. Probably should have used that as the first example to better help your argument, though I suppose if it's just one retailer upselling the Switch 2, one can choose to go elsewhere, right? And again, economics boil down to what people are willing to pay for, so there's bound to be someone silly enough to go for the higher priced Switch 2. Hell, that's literally a scalper's business model, as much as we loathe them for it.
Assuming they can actually sell the product and it doesn't sit on the shelf forever, that is.
Alright, good. I just had to be more patient and I got 2 examples of price drops. Excellent.
Anyways, the point is, due to assorted retailer shenanigans, individual shopping experiences will vary wildly and store-listed prices are not reliable as pricing data. However, since all retailers use MSRP as a foundation for their pricing strategies, MSRP can be a reliable measurement for estimating historical pricing data.
Oh, am I finally getting my why bring up MSRP answer? I suspect I already know where this is going, since we're talking about historical pricing data, but hey, your video's title had the word inflation in it, at least when I first saw it posted to Discord, so we were bound to get to this argument at some point. And as fair warning, another channel called Extra Credits tried to make the argument a few years ago, and got roasted for saying that old school games would be worth 100 by today's standards, therefore it's okay to charge that now. Never mind that there's a hell of a lot more people buying video games now at various different income brackets, so you don't reach as wide an audience by doing that, to say nothing as to how DLC throws a wrench in the gears. So I'm going into this with a lot of skepticism.
Okay, now we can look at data. Time for the graph.
Giraffaric, the long-necked Pokemon. Giraffaric has a second head on its tail that bites those who approach it carelessly.
Ahem. Graph.
I can appreciate the self-deprecating dig, but we're finally getting to something I've been asking about for a while, so you'll forgive me for feeling a little impatient right now.
This is a graph showing the average MSRP for each console, unfortunately only in USD. I'm not American myself, but the overwhelming majority of my viewer base is. Americans already cannot comprehend alternative measurement systems like metric, so for the sake of minimizing confusion, we are sticking with USD.
Dude, again, the digs are unnecessary, and do more to hurt your attempt to reach out to the unwashed masses than helps it. You can just as easily say we're sticking to USD because then we're not bouncing back and forth between different currencies and economies, each of which would have its own varying circumstances and exchange rates at different time frames, to keep the example as simple and easy to understand as possible. The fact that most of your audience is in America would be merely a contributing factor in that case. And even if we're all dumbasses who can't mentally convert between an inch and a centimeter, which, to be fair, guilty as charged, what's wrong with having major currencies like the euro included, even if we may not know the exact exchange rate? It'd still be useful information to have as a point of comparison, especially when the varying price for Mario Kart Worlds in Europe made this firestorm worse.
Discounting the Atari era, we can actually see that prices have remained fairly stagnant across time. Game prices stayed at $49.99 MSRP from 1995 to 2005, from the PlayStation 1 to the Xbox. Then in 2005, the Xbox 360 and PS3 pushed MSRP to $59.99.
Alright, I suspect this isn't new information to anyone in either of our audiences, but carry on.
Nintendo, however, continued to maintain the $49.99 MSRP for another 6 years throughout the Wii era, before increasing to $59.99 with the Wii U in 2012. MSRP then remained at $59.99 until 2020, where the PS5 and the Xbox whatever the hell it calls itself now pushed it to $69.99.
Alright, good dig at the expense of the Xbox naming convention, and probably half the reason why the Switch 2 is called that. The other half being how well the Wii U sold if I were a betting man.
And now, 5 years after that, in 2025, Switch 2 bumps it up to $79.99.
Yes and no. Donkey Kong Bonanza is still marked as $70, which makes the $80 price tag on Mario Kart World even stranger. In fact, there was a statement from Nintendo saying that there'd be variable pricing, which I suppose makes sense, since they asked for $70 on Tears of the Kingdom, but only $60 for Echoes of Wisdom, so this isn't a new phenomenon. The concern that raises is whether they'd ever use that as justification to go beyond even 80, as the shock of going from 60 as the initial asking price to 80 on the Switch 2 launch title is already a tough sell, and makes you wonder if they'd do any further price jumps if it's gonna be that severe now.
If you are wondering why the graph doesn't include the Switch 2, well, that's because it was originally published in 2022, which is nice because it's guaranteed to be made before any sort of Switch 2 pricing bias would have existed.
I would have first assumed that it's because it's not even out yet, and because of the variable pricing bit I just mentioned, but good to clarify where you got your information.
Alright, lots of numbers. What the hell does this all mean? My dear viewer, let me ask you this. When were you born?
Early 1995. Yes, that does mean I am an old by internet standards. You are free to laugh at me now.
Well, according to my YouTube data, the majority of you are between 18 to 34 years old, so anywhere from 1991 to 2007. You've spent your entire lives knowing the price of a video game is either $49.99 or $59.99. You've grown used to that number. That price feels normal.
That's a fair assessment to make. It has indeed been the norm for a long time.
Humans are creatures of predictability. Once something is ingrained into their minds as normal, they come to expect it to always be that way. People generally resist change and sometimes need to be dragged kicking and screaming into it.
I'd argue it's more a matter of our minds being so resource intensive that we take any chance we can get to simplify the playing field, therefore we tend to get used to our current environment. Still, we're aiming for the same idea. Humans don't like it when something unexpected or novel happens, because it can be scary when the known becomes the unknown.
This is a huge reason why Nintendo's price hike feels like such a shock. It's a sudden change to something which has been a constant in your life.
That makes sense to me. I, being used to PC part prices and curious to see how the Switch 2 compares to the Steam Deck, looked that up, saw the price comparison and thought, oh, that makes sense. Someone who only knows Nintendo consoles being $300 or lower who isn't as knowledgeable would go, wait, 50% price increase?
What?
Even if you aren't the sort to get hung up over it, the price jump is still financially substantial. $20 over the Switch 1 standard of $59.99 is a 33% increase. That feels like a lot, because to some people, that is a lot.
Indeed. Perhaps that's why I tend to be more sensitive to it, as half the time I still have the spending habits of a broke college student. Even after figuring out what I wanted to do for a minor PC upgrade recently, I still found myself hemming and hawing before hitting the purchase button, even though I was spending half of what I initially paid to build it.
Remember, different countries have different earning power. It might be more reasonable if you notice the PS5 and Xbox Twitter's $69.99 MSRP, because that indicates a trend. After 5 years of that, one would think a price bump wouldn't be so bad.
By one view of the graph, but that's only the most recent trend. $50 was the standard dating back to PS1, and only jumped up to $60 with the PS3, so we'd expect it would only jump up to $80 with the PS7, not the literal next console generation. Also, I know it went by fast, but Xbox Twitter? Good job, I appreciate that.
However, those consoles were released in 2020, the same year that the COVID pandemic began worldwide. Yeah, can't blame anyone for not paying attention to game prices then. There was a lot more important stuff on everyone's minds, to put it lightly.
Oh, I remember people being annoyed back then, too. Again, I would sooner point to the trend line more broadly and consider the Switch 2 an anomaly by the historical record you're trying to present.
The listed number of a price has a significant impact on our psychology because it is the means through which we perceive value. This perception is also obscured by services and alternative pricing models. Paid subscription services like Xbox Game Pass, Steam sales, microtransactions, gacha systems, collector's edition options, and many more divide the price of a game across multiple areas and prevent people from realizing just how much they are paying or how much value they are paying for.
That's a fair assessment as well. Getting a one-to-one between value and dollars spent can be difficult, given how it's broken up and our investment therein. To go back to the product is worth what people are willing to pay for bit I mentioned near the start, this is where that becomes most evident. Someone who is hyper-invested in a free-to-play game may have no qualms throwing $20 down for a skin due to how much fun they've had with the game already, but may only buy a random indie game if it gets a 75% off deal on Steam. To use a recent example, someone in my D&D group had been introduced to Repo, one of the more recent indie darlings to show up out of nowhere, and on a night we weren't prepared to play, he bought everyone there a copy of the game. Before I could even protest and say, I'm not really a fan of horror, I said no to Lethal Company for the same reason, and he made the purchase. Well, I'm committed now, and alright, this is actually pretty fun, since there's enough people around for shenanigans to offset the horror element. Maybe I shouldn't have said no to Lethal Company. It's not something I would have bought on my own, but since a friend already did, because it was worth that much to him, I have a copy and have had fun with the game. For the cost of Mario Kart World, I can buy 8 copies of Repo. But since they're such drastically different games with very different draws, how exactly do I make the comparison? Eventually it just boils down to personal preference, and it's hard to point to one metric regarding a game's price or sales figures and saying that it's worth a certain percent relative to another game.
However, Nintendo doesn't do that. They list their prices upfront, the old-fashioned way. When you buy Mario, you pay the full price and you get the full game. Instead of paying small amounts for small incremental pieces of the pie, you pay for the whole pie.
Until they eventually give us DLC a few months to a few years down the line, because a lot of Nintendo games get DLC, which is also the reason for the concern. A lot of people have been badly burned by other AAA publishers finding every chance they could get to charge extra. So when they get even the slightest hint that it might show up from a company that's otherwise upfront and honest with them, of course they're gonna react badly. Granted, Nintendo isn't perfect, even in the games department, as others have noted that they've charged more than the original asking price on remasters occasionally.
Next time anybody complains about missing the traditional game pricing model, point them at Nintendo because they've never stopped doing that.
Assuming you don't mind expansion passes on most of the new games from Breath of the Wild onward, though at least it begins and ends there. Hence why people will be annoyed if they have to pay extra, and then there's DLC on top of that.
The sheer bluntness of this price really impacts people's perception. Nintendo's practice of never reducing their game prices over time also doesn't help this, because there is nothing which can mitigate that price. It makes the game price feel like something concrete and immovable, with no way to sneak around it. Nintendo makes game purchasing extremely straightforward to the customer. This is our price. If you want to play our game, you pay this price. That's it.
Again, minus DLC, but that is a fair argument to make. If memory serves, Ubisoft got themselves into trouble by conditioning people to wait for sales by doing substantial discounts within months of a new game's launch. Granted, they've got bigger issues to worry about right now if the reception to the latest Assassin's Creed is anything to go by, but you get the point.
However, price numbers alone do not reflect a product's actual value. Anyone who's studied basic economics knows where this is going. Inflation.
And here we are. Now the real fun begins, ladies and gentlemen.
How revolutionary. Truly, this is an excellent demonstration of everything I've learned from my MBA course.
Yeah, we all knew this was coming, so I can respect the self-deprecating dig.
Unfortunately, this is the most logical place to start explaining stuff because it really is the key foundation for everything.
Okay, now I'm starting to wonder if you'll fall into the same trap that extra credits did, but let's not jump the gun again.
So if you already know this, well, either skip ahead or bear with me for the benefit of those viewers who didn't study economics in high school.
Well, since not everyone watching this video might have a good grasp of the concept, I'll be curious to see how close our definitions are. So carry on, good owl.
Alright, everyone's heard of inflation before. It's the magic word that people use to hand-wave why stuff keeps getting more expensive. Here's a very simplified explanation of how it works.
Alright, before I hear your explanation, let's take a look at that visual. Step 1. Increase in supply of money. That's my understanding as well. Government prints more money, that means there's more currency in the system, therefore because it's less common, its purchasing power decreases. Step 2. Increase demand for goods and services by virtue of more money being present. Think the inflation that we saw following the pandemic due to people who could work from home still receiving stimulus checks, meaning they'd have more buying power in that moment. Step 3. Reduce supply of goods and services. Self-explanatory from prior step. If more people are buying, there's gonna be less supply. Step 4. Price increase due to lower supply. Also self-explanatory, as when you've got only a little supply and a lot of demand, you can get away with charging a premium to get the people willing to pay top dollar, as it were. Finally, step 5. Reduced purchasing power, since the cost just went up. Not a bad way to summarize it, honestly. Let's see how you go into more detail.
Firstly, the total supply of money circulating within the economy gets increased. Either the central bank prints more money or interest rates are lowered. Lower interest rates subsequently reduce the cost of loans. Consumers and businesses pay less interest on loans, which means cheaper mortgages, auto loans, and business investment.
Yep, that checks out. Carry on.
In other words, it's cheaper to borrow from the bank to make big purchases like buying a house, which in turn means people have more money left over to spend on smaller purchases. Lower rates also mean reduced value in savings, so people are more inclined to spend money instead of keeping it in a bank. Either way, consumer and business spending increases.
Yep, that checks out as well. Do I see 3 for 3?
Because consumers and businesses are purchasing so many products, supply is unable to match demand. So businesses invest into their production capabilities to meet demand and better take advantage of the higher demand and profitability. Said rapid expansion is easier thanks to the aforementioned interest rates being lower, which make bank loans and investment costs cheaper. This results in both supply and quality of goods increasing due to investments producing advancements in technology, and the high consumer demand encourages businesses to compete more aggressively to dominate the market. Businesses expanding production capabilities also creates more jobs within the economy because companies need to hire more staff. More jobs means the total number of paychecks being distributed increases. Additionally, more jobs means employees have more options, giving them the freedom to quit lower-paying jobs in favor of ones with higher wages or better work conditions. Employers have little choice but to acquiesce and offer better pay to attract these workers. They need to staff more.
That's a lot to pack into a step 3, but looking over the transcript a couple of times, it's certainly an ideal way of looking at things, since one might seek to improve their profit margins by cutting corners, including ones they probably shouldn't. But this is how it's supposed to work in theory. Though you did qualify this by saying it's a simplified version, so we'll call that a nitpick on my part and move on.
All these increased wages and expanded production, in turn, increased production costs, which subsequently causes prices to increase.
Pretty much. There's always going to be competition of some kinds, whether it be between specific products or attracting the staff you need, which is going to mean resting on your laurels isn't a good option in the long term.
The rising prices of goods eventually decreases demand until it returns to equilibrium. However, there is still a higher supply of money circulating in the economy, leaving us with the end result of reduced value of money but a higher quantity and quality of goods within the economy as well.
Yep, there's always that oscillation, and it's why booms and recessions are an inevitability. Though one might hope that our quality of life will still increase over time.
Now, that's the basic TLDR of the theory. But as every economist knows, reality does not match theory. There's a huge number of buts and ifs and other details I did not dive deeper into. For example, wages have grown but not as much as they are supposed to. Globalization means that certain industries are able to outsource many jobs overseas to keep prices lower than they are supposed to be. This meant that the overall economy continued to grow, but wages ended up stagnating and we get the mess we have today.
Good on you to mention that, as it'll end up being the primary reason why people are upset with the current prices. While there may be economic pressures on Nintendo to offer the Switch 2 at $450 or risk selling the console at a loss, that doesn't mean people stateside will be able to afford it, even with manufacturing in places like China and Vietnam being a hell of a lot cheaper for a number of reasons, such as the current scale of production, labor laws, government subsidies, and lower cost of living.
But if we delve too deep into all the details, we'd be here forever, so let's just stay focused on our topic of game prices.
For the sake of explaining the price, you can certainly keep focused there, though the fact that people will then say, "Oi, but those other things," will make the argument a harder sell overall. Depending on the kind of feedback you get, it may be worth going into excruciating detail on a future video. Though based on what you'll say at the end, perhaps a lighter topic would be good to discuss before looping back here. Still, let's get back on topic.
Remember what I said about prices increasing as part of growth? Yeah, inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. At moderate levels, it is actually a natural feature of a healthy, growing economy. An economy is driven by consumers spending money, which sustains and creates businesses, which creates more goods and jobs, which generates wages, which leads to more spending, and so on. As long as people continue to spend, inflation and economic growth will continue, even without the central bank's involvement.
Pretty much. If I'm selling burgers for $5, but 95% of my consumers would still stick around if I sold them for $6, then I could do that and use the extra profit to expand my business, such as improving the burgers or by funding a second location. Alternatively, if my main supply of beef gets contaminated by something and I'm unable to sell as many burgers as normal, I may be forced to raise my prices to keep my business operational. The former fits more into the positive camp, while the latter fits into the negative camp, but both will result in inflation.
Yes, the value of each dollar decreases over time, but this is accompanied by increased quantity of dollars, improved product quality, technological advancements, and general quality of life. This is what happened with games.
We are certainly a far cry from where computers used to be, even back when I was an infant, to where there's a lot more that computers are capable of. The idea of playing Smash Bros. On a plane without grievous inconvenience was a pipe dream when the franchise began on the N64. The fact that Nintendo was able to keep the price at $300 for the Wii, Wii U, and Switch is honestly surprising in that light, as while they were technically weaker than their competitors at the time, the Switch still innovated a lot while keeping at that same price. Though, as we'll be bringing up later, with technological advancement, it's also a lot easier to get into game development, with engines like Unity, Unreal, and Godot all offering a layer of abstraction that lets you focus on the game itself, instead of all the little things required to render the graphics correctly. So one could argue that the price didn't necessarily need to increase. Hell, even games like Hearthstone and the Gen 4 Pokemon remasters used Unity.
The world has come a long way since the time of the PlayStation in 1995. Various countries' economies around the world have grown significantly over the past 30 years, and inflation has occurred along with it. This is why the price of goods has increased over time. It rose alongside wages and the total money supply on a global scale.
Yep, that's a good explanation for it. Is this where you tell me it's justified that Mario Kart World is 80? That is what the video was setting out to explain after all.
However, the price of video games has remained relatively stagnant. It remained stuck at $49.99 MSRP from 1995 to 2012, despite the actual purchasing power of that $49.99 being very different between those years.
And there's a number of reasons for that which MSRP doesn't fully capture. We've said a few already, but since it's relevant to the current matter, let's go down the line. It's now easier to make games due to proprietary engines like Unity and Unreal. As while both have license fees, it means onboarding new talent is a lot faster, due to their ubiquity. Also, as we've seen with both Metroid Dread and The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, you can use the basis for one game as a starting point for another, which keep costs down by ensuring you don't have to create everything from scratch the second time around. The audience is now a hell of a lot bigger, and with digital games rising to prominence thanks to Steam and the internet becoming more ubiquitous, you can reach more people, meaning you don't have to charge as much, and can give sales more often since used games aren't as prevalent. In fact, there was speculation that digital games would mean cheaper games in the moment, when they were becoming more commonplace. Which ended up being a freaking lie. The publishers just increased their profit margin by not having to manufacture game discs, which then meant I was completely unsurprised when everyone said that prices might be lowered when the Epic Games Store was reducing the store cut on games sold there, which also didn't happen, they just pocketed the extra as before. Say what you will about this offsetting the cost of inflation, but from a consumer standpoint, you can hardly blame us for having trust issues. While digital games specifically don't apply to Nintendo as much, the fact that the European version of Mario Kart World has a higher price on the physical edition suggests that this is something they're thinking about as well. Especially since, while the gold point system was present, you got more from digital games than physical, assuming you even remembered to register the physical games for same. And that's before we mention DLC, which if you look at the prices on the Switch Pokemon games, you're paying $90 for Gen 8 and $95 for Gen 9, if you want everything. Granted, Legends Arceus didn't get DLC thankfully, and I'd be surprised if Legends ZA gets any, so it's not a golden rule, but MSRP alone isn't the only metric at play. To some extent, with their DLC practices, they've already been playing the variable price range game, the only difference being that we can commit to the DLC after we've seen whether the base game is worth investing in, hence why I own the DLC for Fire Emblem Three Houses but not Fire Emblem Engage. We could go back and forth on whether we prefer the upfront cost or DLC we commit to later, but hopefully this makes it clear that on the consumer side, it makes sense why MSRP has remained largely stagnant.
To understand the actual value of a video game at that time period, we need to adjust these prices for inflation.
Or we can just reference everything said earlier, which I feel countermands or directly addresses inflationary pressures, but never mind me.
Here, have a look at this photograph.
Giraffe.
Haha, very funny. This graph
Look at this graph.
Okay, that got a chuckle out of me at first, but I'll be tampering with that when putting it into my own video because RIP headphone users, myself included.
I'm back.
That bit would have been a lot less painful if you had peeked in your audio software but lowered it when doing audio balance with everything else. And why was that cricket sound effect so much louder than everything else? Again, RIP headphone users. So, what were we talking about again?
now displays how much that game's price would have been like based on 2022 levels of inflation. That $49.99 MSRP on the PlayStation 1 in 1995, that's equivalent to 100 USD in 2022's money. That's right, a PS1 game cost more than a Switch 2 game. And let's not even talk about the NES, or gods forbid, the Atari.
And again, the market was also a lot smaller back then, with it being a niche enthusiast market rather than a general entertainment market. Though, thinking about it now, a better argument you probably should have used is the fact that we may be hitting market saturation, if the current state of live service games is anything to go by, as that could be a decent argument for why listed prices are rising now, and in a seemingly more drastic manner. There's a limit to how many new consumers can be reached at this point, so companies may choose to look for ways to maintain and get more from their current audience rather than expanding the audience.
Adjusting a price for inflation gets you its real price. Remember that capitalization, it puts into perspective the real value of how much that price was actually worth in those times.
Assuming you don't account for DLC, but I suppose by your example, that likely wouldn't cover the totality of it, even if it's a $70 game with DLC. Which Nintendo thankfully has yet to throw at us. Yet.
Also, if you're curious, the listed price is actually named the nominal price. We can see the difference between the real and nominal prices have consistently narrowed over time. This is because the American economy and average wages have grown significantly since 1995, and the resulting inflation that came with that growth has devalued the dollar accordingly.
Okay, that gives the explanation, but there's still over 10 minutes of video left, so what more is there to say?
Put simply, $49.99 used to be worth a lot more purchasing power back then because people earned a lot less money back then.
Yes? Is there more to this argument, or are we going to be reframing this one a few more times?
This other draft makes the price difference more apparent. Son of a...
Alright, that one got a chuckle out of me. Well played. Let's take a look at this graph.
As we can see by this graph, the real value of $69.99 would have been pretty huge back in the 90s, but it's a lot less in modern times. The truth is that despite the nominal price of games increasing, the real price had actually been steadily decreasing. Games were actually becoming cheaper and more affordable, allowing them to reach a wider audience. Ergo, more demand, more revenue, and theoretically, more profitability.
On that we agree, thanks to everything I mentioned regarding digital games and with technology improving.
Except, well, not exactly.
Go on.
See, profit has two main components, revenue and costs. And oh boy, did costs increase, as shown by this chart.
I'm dubious on this claim as stated, given everything I've mentioned. But before I hit the bullshit button, let's see what you have to say first.
With advancements in technology came improved consumer expectations. Games and media were now capable of doing so much more than before, and audiences began wanting more and more and more. Creating all that quality is not cheap.
That's a fair counter-argument, as people will want something new or better than what was had before. The reason something like Stardew Valley took off was because it took a niche that had been done before but hadn't had a major hit in a long time, gave it a fresh coat of paint, made it work well on modern hardware and display settings, and offered a lot to do within it, to where basically everything gets compared to Stardew Valley instead of Harvest Moon nowadays, and has trouble matching it. In the opposite direction, because I had played Baldur's Gate 2 before the first game, it then meant I didn't receive the first game as well as I might have otherwise.
Here's a good example. This is Dave the Diver. This game sold for 20 USD and had a team of 5 to 25 people. Tell me, how much do you think this cost to make? Their total budget was under $10 million. Yeah, you want a good game? You need a couple $1,000,000 and a couple years.
You say that like it's a lot of money. To be clear, it is, as it's more money than most of us watching will ever see in our lives. But when you're looking at hundreds of millions spent by AAA studios, a AA game like that is a pittance by comparison. Even if you apply those numbers to an American studio, and say half the costs are being eaten up by things like marketing, $5 million will still pay 25 people for $100,000 a year for 2 years. And since the game is being charged at 20, all they need to recoup that money is 650,000 copies sold at that price point. Bearing in mind that number factors in the 30% cut taken by digital distributors like Steam. which also sounds like a lot, but is again a hell of a lot less than what the big AAA studios need to make a profit. Need I remind you that Square Enix would see multiple millions of copies sold for games like Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider games and call those sales figures disappointing? Game dev might not be cheap, but does it have to be millions of copies sold doesn't cut it expensive. As far as I can tell, the future is AA, especially given an example I'll be bringing up later.
If you seriously think making a good game is as simple as putting 12 guys in a room, you're honestly kidding yourself. Running a game studio is expensive, even an indie one.
But that's literally how game dev operated before it became mainstream. Sure, you had overhead from marketing and distribution, but that's literally how games like Halo were developed. A bunch of guys in a room, passionate about development, making something they wanted to see. Look at the dev videos for Repo and tell me that's somehow impossible in current year.
You need programmers, artists, designers, music and audio, QA testers, producers, localization and translation, and so much more. You need equipment like computers and software. You need to pay rent for a workspace, utilities and communications, taxes, and all sorts of other costs. If you want more quality, you need to hire more staff, pay for more resources, and rely less on outsourcing.
But how much of all of that do you need, and what aspect is the most important? This is something I'm actively contemplating right now, as I do have game dev ambitions, and what I've chosen for a first game would benefit from voice acting, but is that something I should go for? On one hand, I'd be able to get more people on board if I did include it, since it would mean less reading, especially given how important the story component will be. On the other hand, would the people I could draw from same be enough to offset the cost of adding in voice acting, assuming I could even find good talent and give proper voice direction? That's why this argument is falling flat for me. If you aren't spending the big bucks, you don't have to make the big bucks in return. Baldur's Gate 3 attracted a lot more people to it than a normal CRPG because of the voice acting and motion capture, but that also meant it had to sell more to break even. It's a bargain that worked for them, but Larian has also been making CRPGs for a while, and therefore had the reach with both their own reputation and a respected name like Baldur's Gate to get word of mouth going. Since I don't have any of that, I'm okay with starting more humbly for a first project, and focusing what direct spend I'll have to on artwork and music.
As you continue to scale upwards, you also need to appoint additional producers, managers, and HR who don't even do any development work and focus on keeping track of the entire mess. That is a lot of salaries.
And depending on your perspective, it's a lot of bloat.
And there is also time. At the end of the day, games need time and time is money. Making a good game is a marathon. This isn't a game jam. You can't expect to crunch for 24 hours with no sleep for years non-stop. People need to rest, which means time and therefore cost. Hiring more people can help reduce time by increasing cost, but only so far.
So it sounds like we're coalescing to the same points, though it looks like our focuses are different. You are naturally taking the perspective of the developer and publisher, who, in order to make number continue to go up and therefore sustain their business model, have to constantly be innovating and delivering more and more, which then drives costs up, and requires you to sell more as a result. However, I've been approaching this from the consumer perspective, where despite the ballooning costs, the perceived quality of games has been going down because the big guys are going for what's safe. Granted, Nintendo tends to branch out more, but they also have the luxury to, given the amount of liquid assets they're allegedly sitting on for a rainy day.
Some tasks are dependent on other tasks being finished, and there will be lag times due to communications, delays, logistics, and need for rest. No amount of people you hire can overcome that. After a certain point, you start getting diminishing returns with each new hire. Eventually, you may end up with negative returns. Looking at you, Ubisoft.
Oh, do I have the perfect example to demonstrate this point. It's a lengthy excerpt from a blog post, but which I feel illustrates the point well, though I'll be withholding the source until I've read out the whole thing to prove a point. Today, the world has gone crazy. Even simple, short linear games are developed by hundreds of people, and sometimes I really don't have a clue what all these people are doing. You simply don't need 300 people and $60 million to make a 5-hour-long corridor shooter with 5 types of weapons and 10 levels with established technology. I know people who worked on some famous franchises. When you ask them what their work on the game was, they usually answer minigun for the second level boss and enemy soldiers in red shirt and blue shirt, after several months of work. That's an example of the modern games industry's efficiency. The worst thing about it is that while working on those 3 models that would normally take 2 weeks to finish, they were constantly crunching. Last year, I received a proposal to work for one of the biggest publishers as a writer on a big franchise. They asked me what exactly I'd done in the past, and so I answered that I wrote most of the game design, mission design, complete story, most of the dialogues, plus I also designed controls and parts of the GUI and HUD. Of course, I mentioned that I worked with other people, but I did all that stuff mostly myself. There was a moment of silence on the other side, and I believe I overheard coughing as well. We have a team of 30 people for that, sir. You would be one of them, working together with our creative director, producer, lead designer, lead level designer, and lead writer. Shit. What are all of those people, plus 20 writers under them, doing on the design of a linear FPS shooter? A script for a 2-hour movie has 120 pages. At the speed of 3 pages a day, I can write it in 2 months and rewrite it completely 6 times within a year. Who the hell needs a team of several writers to write in-game dialogues, which are usually tragically crappy anyway? I mean, what was the last game you finished and said to yourself, wow, that was a pretty damn good story? Did we really get to the point when there is a manager for every person that is actually doing something useful? In some companies, 2 artists sitting next to each other could not talk directly about their work. They need to ask their dev manager to communicate on their behalf. WTF? This is how games are made today, and also answers the question why they are developed by so many people. Yes, graphics and animations are getting more and more complex, and you need more people to work on them, so it costs more money, but not that much. And yes, some of the games are so big that they must be made by hundreds of people, but most of today's development is just wrong. 15 years ago, when you needed to model a wooden box, it was just a box with a very small texture. Today, it could have thousands of polygons and several huge textures and normal maps. But 15 years ago, there was no Google, ZBrush, digital cameras, CG textures, Crazy Bump, 30-inch displays, or Cintiq tablets. When you needed a texture for a medieval wooden box, you had to pick your ass up from the chair, go to a museum, buy a ticket, take a picture with your analog camera, send it to a mini lab, wait a day, and then scan it. Or draw it with your mouse, hell yeah, a damn mouse in Photoshop 4. Today, it took me exactly 2 minutes to Google for perfect pictures of medieval chests that could be used as reference and for textures. Now think twice before you tell me that making games is more complicated today. That was part of a blog post written by Daniel Vavra, the head honcho of Warhorse Studios, which you may know as the developers of Kingdom Come Deliverance 1 and 2, where he discusses the sheer bloat within the AAA games industry as it existed back in 2012. And then people act surprised when a game like Concord spends hundreds of millions on what amounts to a wet fart. Before someone says it, yes, I know Daniel Vavra is a controversial figure, as both Kingdom Come Deliverance games got roped into the culture war, ironically for completely different reasons for each game, and Vavra's caustic means of addressing same has made him very few friends over that time. That said, while you may not like his attitude or opinions, especially given that dig at storytelling, it's hard to argue with the rest of it. A lot of people, myself included, get into computer science hoping to be game devs, only to realize that if you go through with it, you'll be paid a pittance, crunched so hard you'll end up hating the medium by proxy, to where you'll get burned out within 2 years, right in time for the next hapless rookie standing in line to take your place. Golden Owl will be bringing up the timetable for indie games later in this video, and to preempt that argument, you can say how every indie developer from Team Cherry to Concerned Ape has been knuckling down, spending years and maybe even living on breadcrumbs to make it happen, but that's literally every developer working on a big game like Call of Duty. And for what? Just to make the cloth texture on a character model you won't pay attention to behave slightly more realistically? You'll forgive me if I call bullshit on the idea that AAA game development and indie development are even in the same solar system as each other. If there's wise allocation of resources, like what seemingly happened with Baldur's Gate 3, which had an asking price of $60 by the way, in 2023, this console generation, sure, one person slaving away isn't making a game like that without needing decades at minimum. But in the AAA space, studios like Larian are the minority. Hell, as a point of comparison, a personality called Stuttering Craig noted how the credits for the original Assassin's Creed are 4 minutes long, while the credits for Assassin's Creed Shadows is over 2 hours. And before you get at me for difference in scale, Baldur's Gate 3's credits are a little under 38 minutes. What kind of monstrosity are you making that genuinely requires that many people on a single video game? And that's what has people wondering about the games industry at large, and Nintendo in particular, now that they've made this move. You want to tell us that game dev is expensive? Yeah, we get that. But with the amount of overhead that we see in AAA studios, it's hard to believe that costs on video games would go up primarily because of inflation, when sheer mismanagement is the more plausible primary cause. Given how indie darlings like Repo and Schedule 1 can just show up out of nowhere, no marketing budget, and blow everyone away. Such games may be the exception, as even games that do well like Among Us can take a couple years to be noticed by the industry at large, but why should we be expected to support game studios that seem unwilling or unable to get their house in order, instead offloading the cost of poor management onto the consumer?
Oh, if you need money, you can just crowdfund on Kickstarter. No. Shovel Knight crowdfunded around 328,000. That number sounds impressive, but it was nowhere near enough. Their estimated development cost just for the base campaign was $1.44 million. They only barely managed to finish development by shifting multiple features to post-launch updates after they listed their game on Steam.
Oh yeah, Kickstarter is a terrible way to fund a video game, no doubt about it. If ever there was a time for a gamer in the mid-2010s to learn how expensive games actually are, it was through multiple Kickstarter campaigns that took a lot longer than expected and went way over budget compared to what was raised. There's a reason why games like Mighty No. 9 live in infamy, and why even more reasonable campaigns like Skullgirls got heat for saying, wait, 100,000 for a new character? Everyone else is promising the moon with their extra 100,000, what gives? To where they then had to give detailed breakdowns of the costs that go into making a fighting game character. Since that most dev studios have learned their lesson, it's something that people who weren't around back then are unlikely to be aware of, unless they went out of their way to research it. In some respect, I'm glad for this Switch 2 kerfuffle so that I can point people to those days.
These guys were efficient too. They had 6 people and took only 2 years. But despite this, they still ended up working 5 months without any pay and were getting credit cards declined at supermarkets. By the time everything was completely finished, Shovel Knight's total costs ended up being $9 million. That's why they kept reselling new editions all the time. Thank goodness they sold enough to profit.
Precisely. This is why I anticipate AA will be the major focus once the current AAA bloat becomes completely unsustainable, as then you can spend that 9 or 10 million on a game like Shovel Knight or Dave the Diver, and if it fails, then at least you tried something novel and didn't lose that much compared to what you were spending before.
Even remasters are not cheap. Leisure Suit Larry is an old, simple point-and-click adventure game from the 1980s. You'd think producing a remake would be cheap, since the dev team was just 4 people and is just updating all the existing assets. They needed $500,000, and this was in 2012. That's $700,000 in 2025's money.
And while that again sounds like a lot, for the alleged development cost of one Concord, we could have dozens, if not hundreds of games like the Leisure Suit Larry remake. It won't appeal to as wide an audience as the big AAAs, but it also doesn't have to.
If you try to keep costs low with fewer people, you just extend your development time even more. Hollow Knight Silksong spent 8 years in development. Deltarune spent 6 years in development just for Chapter 1. Stardew Valley took one absolute mad lad 4 years. He worked 70 hours a week. That's 10 hours a day, every day, including weekends. For 4 years, with no salary.
And that's exactly what makes the current industry so fascinating. A guy with nothing but a dream can spend years in obscurity and then outmaneuver the big boys by taking on a niche they don't see as profitable in their spending brackets. When survival horror became more action-focused, games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent showed up and ate their lunch. When farming games like Harvest Moon stopped being as popular, Stardew Valley showed up and ate their lunch.
The amount of work required for the game doesn't change. You just end up with fewer people doing more to compensate.
Yes, I'm sure it must have really hurt Concerned Abe's pocketbook to sign on voice actors when he also had no salary of his own. Seriously though, I get your point, that less people means less speed, but again, where is the work going, and is it necessary work?
This will burn people out.
That is certainly a risk, but you run the risk of burnout when you spend a long time with anything. Tears of the Kingdom took 6 years, with the last year being spent exclusively on bug fixing, which clearly paid off given the relative lack of same when I played it, especially with how complex Ultra Hand is. But if that were me doing dev work on that, I'd find that tedious and would be glad to be done within month 6 of that, let alone a year.
Now, scale those costs upwards to big companies like Nintendo, which employ teams of a few hundred. Their costs are exorbitant, and their prices need to be higher to match. Otherwise, they can't pay their staff.
And they do, as Tears of the Kingdom was the first Nintendo game that asked for $70 up front, which I wasn't willing to pay for and therefore waited until I could get a discount. They've already done this once, fairly recently, so you'll forgive me for being hesitant when they do it again for a series I'm not as invested in.
This is why I'm always so angry whenever I hear people demand that games should be cheaper, because they shouldn't.
Wait, what happened to your claim about being emotionally detached about pricing matters within the first 2 minutes? In case anyone needs a reminder, here's what was said.
In fact, I have literally zero emotions or feelings about pricing matters whatsoever. I maintain an attitude of total and absolute neutrality, because I am simply emotionally dead inside whenever I have to do anything that involves economics or business analysis.
Don't presume you can sneak a comment about your emotions in there at the 22-minute mark just because it's been a while. This is why I'm making this response, as I'll admit to looking over the transcript before watching the whole thing and adding commentary, as statements like this make me confused as to what you're trying to achieve. If you truly are just trying to explain to the less well-informed about the economics that go into game development, backed up with some real numbers and the economic pressures that spawn them, then why are you allegedly joking about everyone being wrong, and why are you saying at the start that you're emotionally detached from pricing concerns when that clearly isn't the case? You end up merely preaching to the choir by doing that, as people who are skeptical will just go, "Oh, you think you're better than me, eh? Good for you. I'll just leave my downvote and be on my way." And to be clear, don't downvote his video or harass him. There is good information here, but the way it's presented will mean the people who may need to hear it most simply won't take the time for it.
Players don't fully comprehend just how much time and money it costs to make a game. Or worse, they don't care.
Again, because they don't have to. The consumer's primary concern is whether the asking price is something said consumer thinks is worth putting money down for. When a guy gets home from his stressful 9 to 5, is he going to want to do research on how much it cost a developer for them to decide on a $20 price point instead of a $15 price point? No, he's going to ask, am I willing to pay for that as the one game I may be able to afford for the next few months? That kind of person is going to be annoyed if that one game in a series he likes went from 60 to 80. You yourself are aware of this, for you to mention different economic circumstances at the start of this video, and yet you think it's okay, now that we're this far in, to say this.
Game developers already work killer hours and struggle to pay bills as is. And now you are saying all that effort is for an audience of people who refuse to even pay for it? What do they expect us to do? Work for free? Some devs already do that. I swear, the attitudes of some gamers just make my blood boil.
You say all of this, while saying at the start of this video that you're surprised that a price increase would upset people when you have this low an opinion of gamers. Granted, you say some gamers, and there's bound to be some assholes in there who harass the studio you work for, which sucks and they shouldn't do that, but this video is starting to look less like an explanation and more of an excuse to complain about a vocal minority.
There were times back in the industry where I wanted to scream. I felt like a fool being taken advantage of by the most entitled and unappreciative audience in the world. This is why I switched careers from game development to finance, despite studying and working in game development for years. I loved everything about games, but I refused to abandon my family responsibilities in order to spend my life as a starving artist and work myself to death for no money.
Oh, it is absolutely a thankless industry, which is why my YouTube and game dev ambitions remain part-time work while my full-time occupation is as a software guy. But that's the thing about entertainment industries in general. There's a lot of people vying for the jobs, so wages are subsequently lower than comparable work in other industries, because they know people are passionate enough about it and will put up with that, at least long enough for a company to get their money's worth from them. Again, who's the one to blame here? Gamers for being stingy, or management for not keeping overhead to a minimum and therefore quote-unquote requiring lower wages for their employees?
See, this is what I meant when I said my heart lies in games while my brain handles finance. It's always good to distance yourself from your emotions when dealing with money.
Which you've seemingly not done a great job at given this outburst, but never mind me.
Back to business.
Yes, please.
One last thing we have not yet considered is the type of company that Nintendo is. I talked about costs, but those are just developer costs. They aren't all of the costs involved in a game. There's marketing, publishing, legal, logistics, localization, distribution, and so on. These are costs which game studios don't need to worry about.
Perhaps in the higher end of the industry, but framing it as if it's a unique concern for Nintendo is odd to me. Every game has some work involved for marketing if you aren't prepared to take the risk with just throwing it onto Steam and hoping for the best. Whether that's handled by a developer directly or a publisher is a relevant question for how easy or hard it is, but doesn't change the fact that it's a known cost.
Instead, they are borne by publishers and platform owners, which already have specialized, established infrastructure and can therefore minimize costs. This is why games on Steam are so cheap and go on sale so often. Valve does not bear any of the costs of development or publishing. The only cost they need to cover is operating Steam as a platform. Steam's business model is to maximize total transactions and take a percentage cut on each individual game sale. Because Steam has a library consisting of hundreds of thousands of games and a user base of millions, they can rely on sheer numbers to turn a profit. Being a digital platform also reduces physical production and logistic costs. That is Valve's greatest asset as a company. Publishers and developers, in turn, rely upon these sheer numbers to compensate for their high costs.
You say that as if Steam is the one setting the price of those sales instead of the developers and publishers who post games there, who both have to consider Steam's 30% cut. Steam sales happen so frequently because they're effective at generating interest and revenue from the market built up there, by tapping into consumers who might not have had the interest or money for a game at 20, but might a few months later at 10, which devs and publishers are free to take advantage of as they wish. There are even games out there like Factorio which have basically never gone on sale because their developer didn't want to do so.
Nintendo differs from this because they are the entire chain. They have their own in-house studios, handle their own publishing, and manage their own platform, meaning they bear the full cost of everything. They also have a comparatively smaller user base and games library.
The smaller user base might explain the premium, or the premium may explain the smaller user base, depending on how you look at it. Though I suppose a greater reason for same would be the upfront cost to join in on the platform every few years. As for the full cost, wouldn't taking on that cost be easier for them, as then they get the 30% cut from third-party publishing on their platform, and can cut out the middleman for their own games? Unless you're suggesting it'd be more profitable for Nintendo to publish on Steam due to the cost of maintaining their own service exceeding a 30% take, which is a discussion I'm certain PC gamers would be very eager to have with you.
Their business strategy thus differs from Valve. They maintain high prices because they bear more risk. Their game prices need to cover the full cost of development, publishing, marketing, and platform management. These prices also help fund innovation because the higher profits from successful games helps offset the costs from less successful titles. Games like ARMS, Star Fox, and Pikmin weren't as successful as other titles like Animal Crossing or Mario Kart, but because Nintendo's games maintain a consistent revenue stream, they can afford to take risks with inventing new IPs until they inevitably stumble into a Splatoon.
That is certainly how they've managed to stay ahead of the curve and remain relevant, even as the other major consoles have struggled, and therefore resorted to expanding their audience to the PC market. One could argue how much the current game price allows them to do that, but since neither of us have access to all of Nintendo's financials, both of us are technically speculating on that count.
This is also why they are so resistant to discounts. They don't have the sheer user base numbers which Steam has, so the boost in sales they get is too low to be worthwhile. It benefits them more to avoid training their customers to wait for discounts and pay the full price.
That's certainly how they've got people used to paying more than the original asking price on remasters. Though, given the sheer number of Switch consoles that have been sold, I do wonder at how much the lower user base compared to Steam would be a factor. Still, their current business model as it's been hasn't been an issue for most of its consumer base, because bear in mind, they've been willing to shell out for the games consistently over the Switch's lifespan. The problem now is that Nintendo is asking for a major jump, while also throwing a bunch of other small stuff in there as well. It was one too many things at once, so backlash was had.
Additionally, it's also why Nintendo is encouraging digital sales so much. It removes the retailer from the overall chain of production, and thus grants them a higher profit margin.
And they were trying to encourage further adoption with gold points, but guess how well that's going right now? Again, death by 1,000 cuts.
All of this is possible due to Nintendo's greatest strength as a company, its portfolio of exclusive first-party IPs and reputation of quality. Customers who value the latest games belonging to those IPs have no choice but to accept Nintendo's prices.
And that's what further annoys people. The fact that $80 Mario Kart is coming along, when Switch customers at least have barely had time to get used to $70 price tags on games like Tears of the Kingdom, which they know is virtually non-negotiable if you don't get the bundle. People might have stomached $70 for Mario Kart World, assuming no other factors, and that'll probably be the baseline for any Switch 2 edition, such as for Metroid Prime or Pokemon Legends ZA. But, well, I think I've repeated myself enough already. We're getting close to the end of the video at least, so is there any major point to bring up before we close this out?
We must also consider the console's future lifespan. I mentioned before that inflation is constantly happening. That will hold true even 8 years from now. Switch 2's MSRP is not a price based on 2025. It's based on the future. Whatever price they set would be the standard throughout the entire console's lifespan, which might last for a decade. They don't have the flexibility to raise prices mid-console generation. In other words, that $79.99 would stay as nominal price even after 5 to 10 years of future inflation diminishes its real value and profitability.
Which is why I can accept the $450 price tag on the hardware, but since they were willing to raise prices on Tears of the Kingdom towards the tail end of the Switch 1's life cycle, I find that argument to be a weak one. If the economy really takes a downturn and they have to raise prices to maintain their profit margin, there'd be backlash if it happened in the middle of a console generation, but there's already backlash from doing it at the start of a console generation, so when they choose to bite the bullets, it's entirely their decision. If we're being charitable and assuming that prices must go up. This is also assuming that we ignore improvements to the production line that'll let them keep whatever profit margins currently exist for the Switch 2, or the eventual inclusion of the Switch Lite and Switch OLED that gave options for the consumers primarily using handheld mode, depending on their use case, at different prices.
Alright, so game prices will be high. What can we do about it? Not a whole lot.
Pretty much, unfortunately. We've been going back and forth on specifics, but the question at hand is whether there's enough people who will say no to $80 Mario Kart, or maybe even say no to a $450 Switch 2 outright. Since I fall into the former but not the latter, I'm not sure how it'll shake out, especially since for all our complaining about poor monetization in the games industry, they get away with it because people still buy it. Which is also why Golden Owl here is sadly likely to get a lot of negative feedback for this video. Because even if we agree that everything he's saying is 100% true, it's coming off the back of a lot of companies throwing predatory monetization at us. And when Nintendo suddenly raises prices and has so many little things alongside the big change, there's going to be just as much annoyance at the people defending it as there will be at the people who set the price in the first place. Because without the people who defend it and go along with it, there would need to be some kind of course correction to stay afloat.
The reality of increased costs, the economy, and Nintendo's very structure mean that game prices are not likely to come down, barring severe sales backlash. Which is not likely to happen because Nintendo caters to a very casual audience who is very excited for the Switch 2 and is fairly used to paying for more expensive things than the occasional video game.
On that we agree.
There are a few small things we could do to offset prices, like not buying at launch or only buying digital to avoid retailer markups on MSRP, sharing games with friends and family, or only buying third parties through Steam for discounts. The Switch 1 also still has a significant lineup of upcoming games. We recently had 2 whole directs just to showcase that. You can still entertain yourself without purchasing a Switch 2. Like, they got Marvel!
And that's perfectly acceptable for you and I to say as fellow consumers. And that's what I'd recommend to people if the price is more than you think is acceptable. Even a cheap laptop only capable of running the most lightweight Linux distro you can find still has a massive back catalog thanks to the work Valve has put in to get Linux compatibility for the Steam Deck in a good spot. It's a little insensitive when Nintendo says it though, as Microsoft got backlash when the Xbox One was marked as always online, and the response to active duty military who'd use it overseas without an internet connection was to buy a 360. And we're seeing basically the same mistake being made by Nintendo right now. Even if that's true, people don't want to hear that from the people making the thing, as that then smacks of elitism.
But these are all just putting band-aids on a stab wound. It doesn't solve any real core financial issues. We're just going to have to make compromises with our leisure expenses soon. I really wish I had some magic advice to help, but I really don't. Reality reflects financials, and financials are where dreams go to die.
Well, given the whole talk of inflation, if you're correct on the price eventually being more manageable, in the long term it should sort itself out. It might suck in the moment, depending on how trade negotiations shake out, but this too shall pass.
The world economy is just not in a good place right now, and pretending otherwise won't change that reality. Rising costs on essentials due to tariffs, job insecurity due to AI, wage stagnation, wealth inequality, worldwide economic disruption, an incoming trade war, and so on. Compared to the numerous financial issues in the world, I fear that we don't really have the luxury to complain about something as minor as higher game prices.
This might sound weird, but it's times like this that it's arguably the most important to complain about it. Yes, the world is rapidly shifting due to what's been mentioned, but at times like this, it's important to have an avenue where we can unwind, without concern for what's going on outside. Finding out that not even our entertainment is safe from this is gonna be a compounding factor on people's stress level. Though, even if we can't spend as much on same as we used to due to our own financial conditions, we'll find a way to persevere, even if it may just amount to checking out the free options or replaying something we haven't in a really long time.
There is a lot of people who are about to experience very real economic hardship, especially those living paycheck to paycheck. Buckle up everyone, financially, we're all in for a rough couple years ahead. This video ends on a depressing note, but that's world economics for you. There's no fun in that. I'm sure the next video will be more lighthearted.
Well, I'll be the hopeful one then. Yes, with all the upheaval, it's gonna be rough. But if the world can survive a Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis, we can get through this. Sure, we might not be able to make the big decisions at a macroeconomic scale, but we can at least do our best to keep our little nook in the world as tidy as possible, to where we don't make life any worse for the people around us. It's an idealistic way of looking at things, but the silver lining to situations like this is that it forces us to pay more attention to what's most important, which will mean once there's light at the end of the tunnel, we should be in better shape to withstand same in the future.
There is a lot more I left out about economics, but this video has gone on for long enough. Hopefully, it was educational in some way. If you learned something, do let me know what it was. Teachers love feedback and whatnot. For now though, I've talked way too much about business and economics. I really need a drink.
Alright, since that's the end of the video, let's give overall feedback then. On the whole, there's plenty of good information in there, and apart from a couple of points, you've got good comedic chops, and there wasn't much that was jarring or distracting in the editing department. I should also recognize that we are, to an extent, talking about two different topics, as your focus was on the economics from the perspective of game devs and publishers, without much concern beyond MSRP and inflation. That then meant my focus, offering the consumer perspective, was easy to appeal to, by bringing up the death by 1,000 cuts with the Switch 2 editions and potential DLC, and the possible inefficiencies within AAA gaming in general in order to explain why there was backlash. And I bring this up because, while you say at the start that you're not looking to pass judgment, that's not how your video comes across. Between saying stuff like all of you are wrong and getting angry at quote, some gamers not caring about working conditions for devs, did you make this to educate the masses or to berate them? When expressing an unpopular opinion or argument, you don't get the luxury to throw barbs at people unless you're okay with those people throwing mud back at you. There's undoubtedly some unreasonable people among some gamers who don't care what you say, they'll berate you anyway. But you can't know that for certain if you fire back. For all you know, a guy left a mean or unreasonable comment because he had a rough day at work, and finding out something he was looking forward to is outside of his budget was the last straw. If you're asking us to be understanding of a giant company like Nintendo, I would ask that you extend that courtesy to people whom, unlike the two of us, may not have the time or luxury to debate the finer points. And no, just saying it once at the start of the video and then throwing shade later is insufficient. Commit to being polite, or go full bore and tell us how you really feel. That having been said, that will be all for me today. Thank you for taking the time to reach this point, and I hope this discussion was an interesting one for you. It might be a bit before I post a scripted video like this over here, as I want to loop back to another channel I've been neglecting to wrap up a project there. After that, it's back to work on that keep your politics to yourself video, plus any video I wish to respond to. Oh, and if you don't mind a side of weep shit on a streamer Let's Play date, that's also here as well. For now then, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.